Another criticism that Guha makes has to do with the appeal to Eastern spiritual traditions in deep ecology. So a point that he makes here is that the deep ecologists want to construe these Eastern spiritual traditions in a particular way, basically as having a mostly passive relationship to nature. But that's not really accurate to the history of the traditions that produced thinkers like Lao Tzu or the tradition of Buddhism and so on, that there needed to be a kind of ongoing active relationship with nature among cultivators, a society of cultivators, as Guha puts it, in order for these other views about nature to get expressed, as expressed by like Lao Tzu. So basically the interpretation of the Eastern traditions that is favored by the deep ecologists is a distorting interpretation. It's an interpretation that doesn't recognize the extent to which there has been an ongoing and dynamic relationship between people and nature in the East. It's also noteworthy that two additional small points are noteworthy. That this there's a tendency in what the deep ecologists have said and a lot of other writings about Eastern religion to otherize and essentialize. That is, to treat the East as very different from the West and as having a particular set of characteristics that are relatively homogeneous, and that in the case of the deep ecology, the East is described as, say, having a more emotional relation to nature. It's more emotional, more passive, more immersed in nature, less detached from nature. But all of this talk of immersion and of non-reflectivity or non-distinction, of oneness and of passivity, all of that kind of description, it ends up, even though it's supposed to be valorized according to the deep ecologists, even though they're saying those things are good, the description is repeating a description of the East which comes from an earlier time where the East was devalued for all those reasons. To say that that the Eastern approach to nature is more passive than the Western one, that implies that the Western one is more active, which also implies, if you think action is a good thing, it implies that the West is better than the East, or that the West's approach to nature is more reflective, more rational, more scientific. That, again, if one is tempted to think that the rational or the scientific are better than the non-rational and the non-scientific, then that fits this pattern of valuing the West over the East. So Guha's point here is just that the description of the East, the way that the East is described, is uncomfortably similar to an older way of describing the East, which was used as part of an argument for the superiority of the West. And then the last point is that, and I think this is pretty perceptive, that when you find Western thinkers, people outside of, that don't have a deep personal experience and connection with Eastern religion or Eastern thought or Eastern traditions, appealing to Eastern religion, thought, or traditions, then often their appeals have more to do with the Westerners' own purposes and arguing with each other than they do with actually understanding whatever it is that they're describing or accurately describing it. And so the point there is that we have reason to be suspicious about whatever deep ecologists say about Eastern religion, because deep ecologists don't seem to be pitching their arguments to people who are in the East and are practicing those religions. They also don't seem to be coming from themselves having a deep experience with those things. They're rather just appealing to those things as authorities to make the case for one or another policy position with other Westerners. So the way that they're using the material dialectically, like their purposes in drawing on this material to make an argument and who their audiences are, already suggests that there's probably going to be some some distortion in how they handle that material. And then the final tenet that Guha criticizes is this belief that the deep ecologists are the most deep of all of the environmental movements, that they're somehow the leaders. They're the sort of they represent the leading edge of environmentalism worldwide. And the criticism that Guha makes of this idea is that from an outsider perspective, deep ecology looks a lot more like a branch of the American environmental movements, and in particular, a branch of one wing of American environmental movements, which is the wilderness conservation movement. That deep ecology is so attached to wilderness conservation, which is such a distinctly American phenomenon, that it's very unlikely that they could be representative of environmentalism worldwide. And here, Guha points to two movements in other countries than the US, that emphasize very different things and don't have this obsession with wilderness preservation that the American movements tend to have. One is the Green Party, as manifest in Germany at the time. Guha is writing this article in 1987, so by now the Green Party is much more of an international party, and of course has representatives in the United States too. But in 1987, they were very strong in Germany, and so that was a good place to look for a representation, kind of representative instance of the movement. And the German Green Party was very concerned with, for instance, economic inequality and unequal access to environmental goods, unequal access to environmental decision making. And so a lot of their politics was about equity and social justice and the way that connected with environmental issues. So they were concerned, about the way that environments and access to environments figures in the lives of people who have traditionally lived in those environments and interacted with them in sustainable ways. That is a very different focus from the wilderness conservation focus of American environmentalism. And likewise, Indian environmental movements have grown out of a kind of struggle between individuals who usually were from rural populations that were parts of traditions of this dynamic and mostly sustainable interaction with environments among we could call them peasants in that area. And the contrast between the interests of those traditional agrarian populations and those of big industry, when big industry wanted to come into various places and say do massive logging projects, chop down lots of trees or exploit some other natural resources, there were these famous standoffs between the local populations that had traditionally made use of the resources there or needed natural processes and resources to be the way that they historically had been and not be radically changed or reshaped by these industry endeavors. There was a conflict between those agrarian populations and their interests and these big industrial interests, and that led to standoffs and famous cases of people, basically farmers, like hugging trees to prevent them from being logged, basically standing in the way of logging operations. And that, again, is a very different kind of movement than a wilderness conservation movement. They're preserving nature because they depend on nature for their livelihood. They're preserving nature from encroachment by big industry and big business. But the sense of the contrast is it's like nature and us versus big industry rather than nature versus humans. And again, Guha's point in pointing to these two movements is to say there's as much of an argument that these are the leading edge of environmentalism as deep ecology. In fact, these movements, deep ecology seems to be missing something very big in at least some very prominent international environmental movements. Now, just to drive the point home about how American this obsession with wilderness preservation is, I'll read through a quotation from Guha's article, a very powerful paragraph here. He says, in the American context, the enjoyment of nature is an integral part of the consumer society. The private automobile and the lifestyle it has spawned is in many respects the ultimate ecological villain, and an untouched wilderness the prototype of ecological harmony. You think about that, right? The automobile, cars, as owned by individual people or families, has produced a lot of environmental damage in the form of CO2 emissions. And untouched wilderness is a kind of prototype of ecological harmony from the American perspective. Yet for most Americans, it's perfectly consistent to drive 1,000 miles to spend a holiday in a national park. Think about that. People do that, right? They drive thousands of miles to go see a national park. They possess, Americans, a vast, beautiful, and sparsely populated continent, and are also able to draw upon the natural resources of large portions of the globe by virtue of their economic and political dominance. Incidentally, their possession of a vast, beautiful, and sparsely populated continent is partly a result of conquest, right? We remember that part of the history of how America came to be the collective property of today's Americans. It involved like pushing indigenous populations out or restricting their claim to portions of land. In consequence, Americans can simultaneously enjoy the material benefits of an expanding economy and the aesthetic benefits of unspoilt nature. The two poles of wilderness and civilization mutually coexist in an internally coherent whole, and philosophers of both poles are assigned a prominent place in this culture. So again, the main point that Guha is trying to make here is that, to some extent, wilderness preservation it's a kind of commodity within the larger consumerist American society. And it's perfectly consistent. The way that it operates in American society is perfectly consistent with burning lots of fossil fuels to get from place to place. So this again is a indication. It's an indication that wilderness preservation shouldn't necessarily be the ideal for environmentalism as such. And also it's a kind of critique of the obsession with wilderness preservation. Maybe this kind of critique would force Americans to reconsider whether their high valuation of unspoiled nature, their high valuation of wilderness itself as an ideal, is not in some sense problematic because of where it comes from as a value within a kind of consumerist society and mindset. So just to aid your memory, I have added on this slide a very, very brief summary of each of these criticisms, which may perhaps help you when you come to be reviewing this for an exam or other questions in the course. And that brings us to the end of Guha's article. Of course, the main question to ask here is, are you convinced by these criticisms? Has Guha effectively shown major problems with deep ecology? Which of these criticisms of Guha's are convincing to you and which ones are not so convincing to you, and why? Do you ultimately agree more with deep ecology? Do you think deep ecology can be defended against these criticisms, or has Guha convinced you that there are too many problems with deep ecology to continue to believe in it or affiliate with it?